All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So today is our second day for Fiqh of Marriage. And last time, let's just go over really quick what we talked about. We were pretty much explaining what our class is about, and we talked about really the word fiqh of marriage. So we talked about the word fiqh and what that meant. And we said fiqh actually means to understand. But of course, in the technical terms, it basically means the ability to derive Islamic rulings. And we said that that's relating to human behavior from the Islamic references, resources. We talked about Quran, we talked about Sunnah, we talked about Ijma', we talked about Qiyas. We also talked about other references, but we made the story short. But when we talked about marriage, we talked about just kind of like an intro of what we're going to be talking about. And for those that are joining for the first time, we basically said that we've got number one, we've got our this page basically has all the different slides that we're going to be using, and that's not all, because we also have another place that we will be using basically as the book that we will basically be depending on. So let's just see where those books are. And we were talking about, where's that book? If you can, let's see, where was it? I'm gonna be finding it right there. I showed you it last time, and it was, can you actually see it? Wait, can you actually see what I'm doing? Yes, you can. And we talked about, the book was actually shared on a different screen. Okay, let me show you the book that we're going to be sharing, inshallah. And if you all can remember, we said that that book is related to fiqh. And that book, being related to fiqh, basically has all these different concise fiqh. That's what we called it. We called it the concise fiqh, right? Concise fiqh PDF. And that was this one. Okay, here we go. I'm going to show you which book that is. And that was basically this book. This is the concise fiqh. And we said that this book basically has a very good overview of a lot of the different chapters on fiqh. So the book is available. You could see on archive. So it's going to be really easy to basically just go back to the website. At least here's the link right there in the chat, and you can find this book. And the beautiful thing is that it has every single topic on fiqh. So everything, just like you when you would study in Arabic, and the translator, basically Jamal Zarabozo, did an outstanding job in making a very good translation. So this is something that will be available to you to actually have access to studying fiqh. So here we go. You could also download the book as a PDF. You can choose to download it as a PDF and basically have it on your iPad or basically on your screen, and make it something that would be available to you. Okay, such a pretty easy thing to basically have, as a tool to use. Now, if you wanted to go for the fiqh of marriage, that basically is on, let's go like that. You're basically going to look over there, and you're going to go back all the way, and fiqh of marriage starts at 367. So here we go. You've got all these different topics right there, and it's going to be almost 100 pages, but really worth reading, really worth not only going for the fiqh of marriage, but even on the other topics. I would consider this as really the summary on fiqh. Now, here's one thing. There is another book that I would really recommend. Okay. And this book is basically by, so it's Evolution of Fiqh and PDF. And let's say Bilal Phillips. Bilal Phillips actually wrote a couple good books. And I would say did an outstanding job. This about fiqh, the evolution of fiqh, does a really good job in giving you, I mean, cannot do better. Does a really good job in giving you this preview in this good, thorough yet not too detailed study on how to understand fiqh and how to understand the science itself. How can we understand that science? What do we need to learn about that science, and so forth? So for those that are really new to fiqh, this is definitely something that would be extremely helpful to help us understand how we have to build this foundation of fiqh. So here's that book right there. It's available for you, and you can actually get it as a PDF. Look at the beautiful content. So you basically tell you what fiqh is, and then tell you about the different types of methods, and then tell you about how the fiqh was established, and then tell you about the different factors that would be affecting fiqh. And then he'll talk to you about the different scholars, tell you about the different madhahib. Many may not be aware of these different madhahib, but he'll tell you some things, and he'll talk about the main reasons why some might actually be contradicting, or some might actually be having conflicting views. So he'll tell you all about that in details. Now, the other thing, if you wanted something that, no, I'm not really good at reading, I just want something to um, just something to understand and think and basically listen to and so forth. So we basically have this series. Okay, let's see. You go to YouTube right there, and we basically have a whole series, Evolution of Muslim Thinking. You see that right there? It's in 14 different lectures, but it would basically give you all the different details about the evolution of Muslim thinking and give you all of that. Now, if you would want the PDF, could also give you the PDF as well to make things easier for you. Now, one thing is that the other website that I would really recommend if you want those, I would say you want those slides and you want all of that, it's basically this blog. It was my blog a long time ago, and I lost the password, so it needs a lot of editing, but at least it has some of those slides that I had. So you've got, here we go, the fiqh of worship, introduction to Islamic fiqh, and it would basically have, here we go, evolution of Bilal Phillips fiqh. Even if you lost the link, you could just go over there and basically get it. The Al-Maghrib evolution of fiqh. That is actually a really good one. Maybe we could open it, right? They did an outstanding job. The Maghrib Institute with Yasser Al-Qadi and Omar Suleiman and all those, and that guy, I forgot what his name was, but something Sharif, he died recently. So yeah, that's basically also a very good thing that they had done. A very good reference. It's just 125 pages, not too bad. And they'll basically put it in bullet points, which is really good because for those, there are some people, they don't want just blocks of information. They want kind of like these bullet points where they could see it in a way, kind of like a mapping way. So that's a very good handbook as well. The easiest way to find it, like I said, you go to my blog, and I just put it in the chat, and you can go to Introduction to Islamic Fiqh, and you can actually find some resources there. Now, the other thing is that you will also have these slides. So here we go. We've got some books as well, which basically a general introduction to the topic. You could see they were really done in 2010, but tried as much as we can to get the password to edit some things, but it was such a long time that, yeah, I just couldn't. Anyhow, so it's available right there. The other thing is that since we basically are giving kind of like an overview, why is it important to understand and study the foundation of fiqh and study how fiqh basically is is or at least the history, let's call it the history of fiqh, because it makes things easier for you to understand why these little fragments, when we're speaking about different opinions, why these little fragments, they may seem contradictory. How do I understand them? Why did this idea basically appear that way? Why do they look too opinionated and so forth? So that's what fiqh in the introduction to fiqh would basically explain. So right now, I'm just going to go over this slide really quick, although I do have a whole video, or actually 14 different lectures just explaining these slides. There are 182 slides. Definitely not going to go over them because, this is supposed to be fiqh of marriage and not the evolution of Muslim thinking, but it's available on YouTube. You got 14 different series, 14 different lectures. But what I want for today is basically these couple slides, 49. Let's see, the resources of fiqh, okay? When we talk about the resources, we're speaking about, so when you say something is halal or something is haram, what are you basing that on? Are you basing it on some sheikh said? So I'm going to say, that's not what we're basing it on. We're basing it on going back to the resource in terms of Quran. So, but you want to keep in mind that in the Quran, it only contains almost 300 to 700 ayat relating to fiqh. When I say fiqh, we're talking about Islamic legislature. Okay, that's what we're talking about. If I would say fiqh as a general term, that would actually mean Islamic legislature. Okay, so out of the 6,236 ayat, only 300 to 700 ayat relate to fiqh. When this second resource, Sunnah, we're talking about what was considered as established by Hadith. And when we say Hadith, we're actually talking about whether a report that was attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, something that he had said, something that he had done, or something that he had approved, or something that the Sahaba themselves had explained that the Prophet ﷺ had behaved in a certain way, a description about the Prophet ﷺ. That's what a hadith is. Okay, but here's one catch. When we speak of hadith, there are different resources that had collected a hadith. So we might have a hadith that are not authentic and others that are. Okay. But just because we say that this hadith is not authentic, that does not mean it's completely fabricated. That doesn't mean we would just reject any hadith that's not authentic, because there are 69 different classifications or different types of weak hadith. Okay, so not because we say it's a weak hadith, it doesn't mean that, oh, okay, that's it, we're going to cancel it out. Not too fast, because some of those weak hadith could actually be not severely weak. We might have a problem because they're really strict on what makes an authentic hadith. So they had all these different 6 conditions on what makes an authentic hadith. So if one of them had a place of question, boom, they'd rather say that it was daif than actually say that it was an authentic hadith. So that's that area of, let's say, that tricky part that sometimes it can influence how we understand the Islamic rulings. The other third one is basically the consensus. When speaking about consensus, it's not always easy to find. Okay, you'll have al-Mundhiri tell me that some things that, 1, 2, 3, this is what they had a consensus on, but not necessarily always easy to find. And usually even the consensus would have some kind of a resource. In other words, they would agree that, well, here's the evidence why we had all agreed, not we as Muslims, but the scholars, at least during that time, They had agreed that this was something that is part of Islam. It usually has some foundation in Quran, Sunnah, or maybe called within what is called al-ijma' al-sukuti, but that's a different conversation. What is al-ijma' al-sukuti? Ijma' al-sukuti is like they had the consensus, but they didn't verbalize it. So that's that area of question. Can we actually say that there was some consensus that they didn't verbalize? That doesn't make sense because if you're going to say that I had said something that I agreed to it, just because I didn't say anything doesn't mean that I agreed to it. Okay, so that's an area of question, but that doesn't mean that everything that they would say ijma, that it's basically within the area of ijma sukuti or they're silent about it. The other piece is qiyas. Qiyas is basically kind of like an analogy. What do we mean by that analogy? We're talking about a condition. In order for us to do this analogy, this isn't based on my vision and my take on something. No, this would mean I would have to have the reasoning for that particular ruling known to us, meaning that the reason which is called the and not the wisdom. What's the difference? Il-illa, we can specify it, we can basically recognize its borders, but in the wisdom can actually fall within the area where it kind of becomes fluid. It's a very subjective thing and not necessarily objective. And then sometimes we can see things differently. So that's why when we're talking about qiyas, it's not an issue of trying to get an inspiration of why I think this matter is halal, haram, obligatory, whatever the ruling is, but it's basically telling me, well, the reason why alcohol is haram is because it leads to intoxication. We've got a hadith that literally says that. Okay. So therefore, anything that leads to intoxication, anything that gets me to the same result is going to take the same ruling. Okay. It's that simple. Anything that leads to the same result that we already know and we have the data for, that would mean it would take the same ruling. But here's the thing. When we talk about qiyas, sometimes it can be a tricky area because of a number of different ways of how we can figure out the illah. Okay, so I'm not going to go in all of that because I've already done it elsewhere. And of course, when we're speaking about fiqh, we're not just talking about one source, at least in terms of legislation when we speak about fiqh of marriage, because fiqh involves anything that relates to human behavior. So we're talking about criminal laws, we're talking about rituals, we're talking about family law, and so forth. I'm not going to go in all the details, but a couple things to basically recognize is this slide right there kind of tells us some things about how to understand authentic hadith, how do we understand a weak hadith, different types of weak hadith and authentic hadith, important resources for hadith and scholars and all of that. So I'm not going to get into that just because, of course, of time. But what I also want to talk about is the principles of Sharia. Stop right there. You really got to pay attention to this one. The resources that we talked about, the Quran, the Sunnah, the Ijma', the Qiyas, okay? Those are the main resources. There are other resources. We'll talk about those later, but there is a key subject here, which is called the legal maxims or the principles of Sharia, or think of it as the vertebra of Islamic Sharia or even the religion of Islam. Now, to make it short, I basically took the first letter of every single one of these words, حفظ الدين, حفظ النفس, حفظ العقل, حفظ العرض, حفظ المال, and I did it in an acronym DNAIM. You're going to be hearing that one a lot during my lectures because it's always, when we're talking about fiqh, it's going to be centered around that area. Think of that vertebra, think of the spine. The spine basically connects all these different things with extremities, your speech, and all these different things. It basically helps you regulate those powers and how you put those areas together. So when you look at the principles of Sharia, we're talking about the preservation of deen slash spirituality. We're talking about the preservation of nafs, life. We're talking about the preservation of mind, aql. We're speaking about the preservation of chastity or family. And we're speaking about the preservation of mal, property, and wealth. And in this order, they all had agreed, at least there was a debate between aql and dird, which one comes first, but in general, they pretty much agreed that the most important and most sacred area in understanding humans is in understanding justice, in understanding social relations, in understanding the vertebra of Islamic legislation, basically considered, well, the foundation and the most important thing is basically spirituality. The second one is the sanctity of human life. The third one is the sanctity of human mind, whether we're speaking about the sanctity in its health, whether we're speaking about physical health, meaning that's why it's haram to drink alcohol or take drugs, for example, and or we're also talking about mental health. That's also part of what would be considered an area of focus as well. Ird and chastity. That's why zina is haram. Zina or fornication or adultery is haram because of the fact that it contradicts the key thing about Islam, which basically considered that preservation of chastity and family is a place of sanctity, is a place that will bring in social justice. And finally, wealth, whether how you're making the income or whether how you're doing the, let's call it money management, or distributing or spending your money, all of that, Islam has a say on it. There are other references, by the way. I'm just going to make it just available to you to kind of see that there's extended analogy, which is called al-maslaha al-mursala. There's the istihsan, which basically considers the juristic preference. There's also tradition and culture. I want you to tap right there on your laptop and just look at that one really well, because many would think that culture and tradition are contradictory to the religion. Not quite true. When would culture and tradition be basically excluded, or we would say, oh, we're not going to take that? Once culture and or tradition, once it contradicts a text or something in the Quran and Sunnah, that's when we're going to say, sorry, that culture and tradition is jahili, we're not going to take it. The other reference is blocking the means of evil. Yeah, the shaitan, happy shaitan right there. That's called sadd al-dhara'i. In fact, even the Imam Malik, he had said that that's 2/3 of the religion. The other one is qawl al-sahabi. What is qawl al-sahabi? Qawl al-sahabi is basically what we would call an athar, different than hadith. A hadith goes back all the way tracing to the Prophet ﷺ. Al-athar traces to the Prophet's companion. Okay, one of these companions could be that Umar ibn al-Khattab, this is what he ruled. The rest of the Sahaba, they approved him. And then we would say, okay, we have an idea now. Or perhaps we would also say, this is what Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had done. This is what Abdullah ibn Umar had said. There's a quote about Abu Huraira, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, whatever it is, that's qawl al-sahabi. Now, how legit is it to reference a sahabi is a place of controversy between scholars. So in other words, scholars debated whether just a reference or something that a Sahabi might have quoted, whether that's considered a reference that I would have to take and adopt as a religion. That's a place of dispute between scholars. They didn't all agree on that. They all agreed on Sadd al-Dhara'i'. They all agreed on, pretty much agreed that if there's no objection in culture, that they would go back to it. They had, I guess, different viewpoints on how to word these, but I would consider the debate is more a feudal debate than actually a real debate. And there's the other one, which is شرع من قبلنا. What does that mean? If I know that historically, for example, I have a reference, Quran, that told me about the previous nations and how it was part of that Sharia of that previous nation. And we don't say anything that contradicts it in Islam. So what kind of, are we talking about the Aztecs? No, we're talking about, let's say, during the time of Bani Israel. And we know that Musa alayhi salam, that this is something that was revealed, just like, for example, that man that introduced his daughter to Prophet Musa. He said, oh, I'll get you married to one of my daughters, but on a condition that you would work for me as a shepherd for 8 consecutive years. Okay, can we get that inspiration and say, here, look, Prophet Musa was actually introduced to that good man's daughter, was not Shu'aib, okay, that man in Madian, and he basically got married in that way. So he didn't go and propose to the man's daughters, but the man had seen the integrity, had seen the amana that Prophet Musa alayhi salam was displaying. So he thought this would be just a great son-in-law for me, especially that I don't have any men, I don't have any boys to basically support me. This would be the great addition to our family. But here's one thing, with شرع من قبلنا, can we use references outside of Quran and Sunnah and actually say, hey, in the Old Testament, this is what we know is permissible or not permissible, and here's what we would know about the reference in terms of the Old Testament, or perhaps the Mishnah, or probably the Talmud, or etc. The answer is no. We cannot use those as references and say, okay, we're getting the inspiration from the Talmud that this is what would be an acceptable legislation. Absolutely not. This is not what it means when we're talking about previous prophets' legislature. So just a really quick thing, okay? Now, some of those resources, I want you to look at this one, some of those resources for studying the different schools of fiqh. So of course, we got the different madhahib, and we said that they're not exclusive to these madhahib. Okay, we said that there are many other madhahib, but those are the most famous ones, and they basically would have their reference. Okay, they'll have their references, they'll basically have a certain books to go to in order to understand and know where and which basically books to go to. So you could see this is just an idea of some of the most important books on just the madhab al-Shafi'i. Okay, this is just the madhab al-Shafi'i. Let's see something like al-madhab al-Hanbali. Look at that. This is just the musnad. Okay, remember when I told you that was almost 50 something in terms of volumes? That's just an idea. For al-madhab al-Hanbali, you could see way less books and way less references to go to, which is making things easier. but definitely just something for you to see. And this is al-Mardawi right there that I usually and absolutely love going back to, because al-Madhab al-Hanbali has a lot of contradicting views, or at least contradicting, what should I call it, fatwas on the different things in Madhab Hanbali, because Madhab Hanbali was not even a madhab. Okay. And we also talked about this beautiful map right there to help us kind of see where we're at. And certainly we have a number of different people that would come either probably North Africa or probably, Southeast Asia, or maybe even Northeast Asia. So you're talking about people that would be various cultures, various experiences, various madhab. So it'd be really good to kind of get, even though I said that's not 100% accurate, at least the map, but it gives me, I would say, a good view on how I can understand the madhab. Okay. And another thing is that right now we do have fiqh assemblies. So we've got a fiqh assembly in the Middle East, we've got one in Europe, we've got one in the US and India as well. And these assemblies, they would basically have some of the most important scholars from around the world, and they would discuss these important topics, and therefore it would be good to basically go to these. Now, here's one thing. When you might have a question, you're like, I'm not really sure who to ask. One thing is that you don't have to follow a specific madhab. You can find a scholar that you know basically has the knowledge, has the piety, and is not answering your question based on their preference, but it's answering the question based on what they would consider as the resources are saying. And certainly preserving your privacies is extremely important, to keep things confidential, to keep things basically to help you feel that your information is not out there. Preserve it as much as you can, especially if it relates to private matters, as much as you can. Call it as anonymous. Don't let people know who you are, and basically preserving your privacy is part of your honor. And certainly you also have to have the wisdom, but the wisdom in understanding that not just because something is halal doesn't mean you go do it. Okay. You have to have the wisdom and see, is this the right thing for me? Okay. So there needs to be a lot of wisdom before we speak about halal, haram, etc. Certainly, halal, haram are basically the most important foundations. But then, just because I say something is mubah, or you have the right to do this, that doesn't mean, yeah, sure, that's it, I'm just going to do it. No, we'll say, wait a minute, is this good for you? Is this, down the road, is this going to be the right choice, the right decision? And of course, if it's a woman, please find a female scholar, or have your mahram or your husband ask for you if it's related to women's issues. And certainly, if you're asking a male sheikh, please and pretty please, with the cherry on top, if you're asking a female related question to a male scholar, he's not your brother. So please do not think that because you're asking a sheikh that you can go in descriptive information, or even get in, let's say, alone in that sheikh's office, or get too close, or probably in, let's call it long conversations with the sheikh. We've had many cases, or maybe I shouldn't be using the word many, but we have had cases of shuyukh basically trespassing their limit. It's not just shuyukh trespassing the limits, but at least we would just recognize that shuyukh are human beings, just like you would have professors on college campuses and students trespassing their limits. You can have a sheikh trespassing his limit as well in the masjid. At the end of the day, he's a human being, and the Prophet ﷺ had said, or baynahuma. Any man and a woman, they would join together, shaitan is basically going to be there. Be specific. Please don't story tell. Wallahi, uqsim billah, one time I had a woman call, and then she told me the story for 4 hours. She was on the phone telling me about how she met her husband and then how she had her first baby and the complications she had on her first baby, on her second baby, and her third baby. And by the way, you see all these, I just said it in just a minute. She went in all these details, and every single time, like, please, what is your question? What is your question? After 4 hours, she said, my question is the bleeding that I'm going through right now istihada or period? After 4 hours of telling me the story of her life and the first time she got her period and when she got married and how her marriage was going through ups and downs and all of that, to basically get to the question after 4 hours, is the bleeding that she's going through istihada or period? Yes, this is real. Please be specific. Be brief with your question. Write it down to make the phone call, or question, or write it down to make this question short. Don't story tell. Go straight to the point. Be as anonymous as possible. If the question is personal, please, pretty please, be as anonymous as possible to preserve your dignity. There are fatwa databases, and some of those very good database fatwa. Islam Q&A is outstanding. I mean, really good. Although I would say perhaps maybe a little bit too academic, but I still think they do a really good job. Islam Q&A, Islam Web is a very good resource. There's also Amja Online. It's a fiqh, it's a Islamic scholars, a jurist, like a more of a committee, a fiqh committee, but they definitely have a really good committee. They do really good research and all of those. So definitely good resources out there. Try not to mention names if the people are known to the scholar. And of course, certainly before going into asking all these questions, spend time learning your religion from specialized scholars, then actually end up asking too many questions. If you had different viewpoints, different fatwa, then in that situation, it's really important to understand that you go back to the scholar to basically help you at least understand the resources and understand, of course, how and what is the preponderant opinion in that matter. Okay, I'm not going to go in all these. Let's see, right there, I think I had, okay, this is it. Inshallah, we're right now going to be starting with the fiqh of marriage. Right now, I want you to remember right there, this basically is our little, I guess, let's go again right there because we have a lot of people coming in. So this is going to be our, oh, okay, here we go. This is basically going to be our reference to kind of make things easy for you. And that way it'll be available. So you've got fiqh, family fiqh is what we're doing. And you've got all the way, you're going to go down and you're going to have all these slides available. Remember, we also have a book that we can actually use. So just keep that one in mind. Okay, let's see. So the first one, we're going to do the intro to marriage slide, but I already downloaded it. So here's how to download it. You basically click on it, and then it basically pops up, a little thing, a little balloon pops up, and then you basically hit on it, and you basically get it. I already had downloaded it, so let's go right there and actually talk about intro to marriage. And let's see, by the way, some slides are repeated, but like I said, I don't have the password for that website anymore or that vlog anymore, so I'm stuck for the rest of my life. It's going to be like that. Okay, let's see a couple things about fiqh of marriage. And certainly now we're going to be talking about these issues as pretty much, let's call it as a foundation. What is fiqh of marriage? What basically is marriage? So we talked about fiqh, now we're going to talk about marriage. So marriage in Islam basically is considered, well, this is just a general ruling, okay, marriage is considered one of the key things to help the Muslim basically grow in their Islam. But that's not actually fitting everybody because marriage has a number of different rulings that relate to it. So certainly, Islam had considered that marriage and human reproduction is basically one of those signs, one of those ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had created as a system within nature, and therefore to see sexuality, to see reproduction is one of those things that even baffled atheists. What if we are to say that an evolution happened, and this evolution to make the male or to make a female or to make a human being or Homo sapien or whatever it is, why and how did the male evolve in a certain way to complete the female to make a reproduction? Those are two different beings, but they're actually going through an evolution according to them. Why did these two separate beings get into an evolution that basically is dependent on one another? Makes no sense. But of course, if the premise is not making sense, well, at least if the conclusion is not making sense, then the premise is not making sense. So that basically is one of the key things. In other words, sexuality and reproduction is one of these key things that that atheists were really baffled about, because it's really one of those ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا. And from the signs of the Lord Almighty had created from your own selves pairs. But why? He said, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, in order for you to find tranquility in. What do you mean tranquility? So we're talking about stability. We're talking about comfort. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and had made and developed between the both of you mawadda. What is mawadda? Mawadda is more than love and romance. During our times and the time of all this social media and exaggerating appearance and exaggerating aesthetics and exaggerating how things are basically appearing on camera, you would see that there's so much focus on making a marriage relationship be just something, whether it's a run on a beach or whether it's flowers basically on the bed with that goose shape on top, and yeah, they're going on a honeymoon, etc., and then they end up living so much in the superficial world that the realistic world they're totally unaware of. But Islam tells you, well, I want you to live a basis that's actually based on recognizing that the foundation of marriage was to create tranquility, was to create love, was to create mawadda, compassion, and rahmah, and mercy towards one another. That's the foundation of family. That's the foundation of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created marriage in the first place. And this is extremely important to recognize, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created a natural order, and part of what will bring you peace mentally, and peace physically, and certainly socially, and the list goes on, is basically going in accordance with the natural order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the world in. So there's the natural fitrah. The natural fitrah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, how the reproduction basically happens from male, female. That's the natural fitrah. Anything going outside of that is going to be considered as a way of a sexual aberration and basically against the religion. Okay, we're going to go in details about that, because there's so many different questions that we'll be covering, inshallah. We'll be talking about LGBT. We'll be going into the real boring details. Okay. We'll also be talking about different types of marriage. We'll be talking about polygamy. We'll be talking about mut'a. We'll be talking about misyar. We'll be talking about divorce. We'll be talking about khulu'. We'll be talking about child custody. We'll be talking about rights and responsibilities, inshallah. We'll be talking about engagement. We'll be covering each and every single day, inshallah, one subject. So bear with me and don't rush things. We're going to get there, inshallah. Okay. And of course, when we're speaking about natural fitrah, this is talking about basically male, female, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created the reason for marriage, or the reason and the method for reproduction as well. All right. And therefore, you could say if going halal becomes worship, then in that situation, if somebody is going against halal, then that definitely would take them away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Simple as that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had, we're going to talk about later, inshallah, is marriage obligatory? Is it sunnah, or what is it? Now, certainly, media portrays marriage as boring, too much responsibility. I know too much responsibility is supposed to be with two O's, too much responsibility. And certainly, you will see feminism coming in and basically portraying marriage as the male abuse over the female. And therefore using, and that's where, of course, Simone de Beauvoir considered that a woman's body is her biggest enemy. So what she needs to do is try to find different ways, whether it's contraceptives, or whether it's avoiding marriage. And even if she were to find it outside of marriage, whether it's in lesbianism, or whether it's in a way that's outside of a marriage bond. In other words, we're talking about zina, because she considered that that was going to be freedom, and a marriage bond was going to basically make her committed in a relationship. So she herself actually fell in two romantic relationships. The first one was with John Paul Sartre, and well, actually a couple, not only these two, because another one was actually her own 15-year-old student. Okay. But John Paul Sartre was one of them, that French philosopher, and he basically wanted to get married, but she insisted that no, we're going to do it outside of marriage, because she didn't want to contradict her views. And then later on, she fell in love with another American philosopher and regret that she didn't actually get married, have children, make family, and basically live the traditional way. Well, too late, Simone de Beauvoir, but let's hope that we don't get indoctrinated with her views, and recognize that there's a lot of feminist influence views out there. Believe it or not, we even have a lot of sheikhs, or at least how they're represented, that actually carry these views. So really have to be careful. That's why Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had said, "Ughdu aliman aw muta'alliman wa la takun ath-thalithata fatahlak." Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, you either become a scholar, or you become a student of ilm, but do not be the third. Why? Because you're just going to be a mob. You don't want to be a mob. You definitely don't want to be just whatever everybody else is doing. You're just going to be following. You want to make sure that you are not getting indoctrinated thinking that, yes, this is to protect me and to protect basically that. And they will come in with all these narratives that sound very appealing. So you really got to be really careful to make sure that you have your vision right. And especially when we're talking about marriage, and when we're talking about marital rights and women's rights and etc., that's where many feminists, they basically jumped into that wagon. And for those that don't have fiqh, they'll basically think that, look, she's actually supporting women's rights. And the other day I was actually on Instagram, and this lady was actually trying to prove that that polygamy is against Islam. And she basically said, well, Islam, that was her premise. She said Islam is basically saying that justice is the foundation of marriage. And it basically said if you're not capable of being just, then you just have to marry one wife. And we already know in another ayah that we can't be just, so then therefore polygamy is not permissible. That was one, taking the ayat out of context. Two, that was basically creating these confusions and putting them together and then coming up with definitely a Western influence fatwa, and thinking that, oh, I'm so smart. So you really just created your own fatwa that never had any scholar or any basis basically say that that is at all considered as inspired by Islam. So just because she went to, and she thought she went to the Quran, when we say going back to the Quran, we're actually talking about going back to the ayat and understanding the reasons for that revelation, in understanding the interpretation. So, okay, reference is one thing, but are you putting the data and the nasikh and mansukh, the abrogation, are you putting in the data and how the Sahaba, how the Prophet ﷺ had explained it, and putting the interpretation basically as explained by the Prophet, by the Sahaba, by the scholars themselves? Or are you making your own interpretation? You're making your own interpretation that was not tracing back to those scholars that had come before to explain to us whether it's our own biased interpretation or whether it's coming from Islam. So yeah, you really want to be careful, because remember, even shayateen have wahi. You really got to be careful. Okay. The other thing, of course, with media portraying marriage as boring, too much responsibility, and certainly that with feminism coming in, telling girls, hey, you need to delay marriage, and of course, maybe within their society, the girls can actually have a non-halal relationship, okay, and they're basically getting active in a different way. But in Islam, it tells you there's only one way to be active, and that is sexually active, is that it's supposed to be within the bond of marriage. And of course, many are basically pushed that you got to get a college degree. And without the college degree, they come in with a mindset, and I would say a feminist mindset. What is that feminist mindset? The man is my enemy, and I have to basically empower myself with the weapons to face the community and to face the man that is coming to strip me away from my rights. So with that mindset, she basically feels that this man is basically supposedly the enemy from the very start and not necessarily a companion. And then, of course, all of that is basically feeding not only mindsets that are prepared to fight, but mindsets that are already classifying the husband, the brother, as patriarchal, misogynist and all of that. And then, of course, that is definitely affecting marriage and how we view it. Okay, delaying the age of marriage is basically part of fasad. Fasad is corruption. Since it contradicts the Islamic order from the beginning, Islam basically considered the natural order is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقْنَا زَوْجَيْنِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ. And we had created everything in pairs, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ, whether تَذَكَّرُونَ, to mean to remember, تذكرون to basically mean to live in the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or تذكرون to mean to recognize orally or recognize mentally, repeat orally, well, basically to say alhamdulillah, etc. And the natural fitra goes in the order and flows in the system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in this world. Going against the fitra is basically a spiritual denouncer. I love using that word. Spiritual denouncer. What do we mean by that? Think of this. When you want to go up high, if you want to go up high, you basically gotta duck. You gotta, first you want to jump. In order for you to jump, you find yourself, I'll tell you, I want you to jump. You find yourself going down and then creating, I guess, some force right there with your legs and then pushing yourself up. All right. And that's the same thing when you're talking about an arrow. The more you push it back, the stronger it basically goes and hits the target. Okay, I'm not telling you to go back, but I'm basically right there saying that a spiritual denouncer is basically something that would take you deeper into the ground and not necessarily higher up. So what am I supposed to do? Push against those gravities that are trying to take you deep into the ground and try and put in basically the effort to go up against your own lust. Okay. And that's why homosexuality, or at least, a sexual aberration, is basically all methods that are outside of legitimate, or at least halal relationship for sexual fulfillment. Why? What's the evidence? وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَى أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ. Those that would guard their private parts, except between, or at least with their wives or with their concubines, or at least we're talking about the slave women. Okay, not thinking, yeah, the slave women. Okay, which today we don't have any. Okay, but وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ. Some scholars actually based this ayah and said it goes farther when we're talking about لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ, any type of a sexual fulfillment outside of a husband and wife would actually be considered haram. Lesbianism, gayism, masturbation, any type with animals, with whatever, this would be considered as haram because the ayah made it clear that it would only be permissible if it is between the husband and the wife. The only area of differences of opinions is the part about masturbation. We'll get to talk about that later, inshallah. In the Quran, any type of a sexual act outside of marriage is called fahisha. And of course, why is marriage important? Because it basically continues life and existence, and certainly the children basically grow up to support the elderly and the cycle of life. This continues the cycle of life, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَاللَّهُ جَعَلَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا وَجَعَلَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَزْوَاجِكُمْ بَنِينَ وَحَفَدًا. And that the Lord Almighty had created from you pairs and made from those pairs, or at least those wives and husband, and they basically came out children and grandchildren. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمْ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً. Therefore, this is a key foundation for any marriage, is to have religious integrity. To have religious integrity actually means you compromise. You compromise when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks you to compromise. The reason why I'm obeying my husband, even though I or you, I'm not necessarily talking about myself specifically, but even though, lisanul halina, there's lisanul maqal and lisanul hal, okay? But even though we may say on somebody might say, well, I'm very there's a good book. It's basically called Surrounded by Idiots. Okay. I know it kind of sounds weird. Uh, but he basically talks about four different types of personalities. But one of them, he talks about the red personality, which is the personality that is controlling, a personality that wants structure, a personality that basically gets into this type of putting everything in a specific order, and that's all they care about. Okay. And yes, you could be a woman that could be like that. And then, therefore, you may struggle to be under this man who may perhaps not have the same mindset as yours in structure, in putting certain things in a specific order. But then the only reason why I would obey my husband is not because I am here, being obedient because of perhaps him empowering me, but no, it's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked me to do so. It's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked me to obey my husband. I'll obey my husband because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered me so. Then therefore, I'm actually following the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm not necessarily here weak per se, but I'm actually here trying to be in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right. Okay, let's see. Marriage to continue, of course, requires taqwa. And we'll talk about that later, inshallah. But taqwa, religious integrity. Man, you may probably have shaitan tell you that this woman is nashes, and therefore, since she is being disobedient, and therefore you could use your right to not spend on her and abuse the fact that she's been jobless for all these years to take care of your children. So now you're basically using and abusing that she doesn't have a way out. She's right now, just like in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, "Awanun indakum." She's like a hostage there, and you are abusing the fact that she doesn't have an income, she doesn't have anywhere to go, and basically easily can abuse your power and say that, hey, yeah, since you're not going to be obedient, here's I hated the way that you talked to me, and since that was disrespecting me, and I'm going to teach you a lesson, and then use that. That's not taqwa. That's not taqwa. To think of yourself as a god, and that every time she talks to you, she would have to come bow down and kiss you like a king, or that even in heated arguments, she has to, tone down, don't talk to me that way, etc. Wait a minute, you also have to recognize that she too is to be respected as well. And certainly, we're going to get into lots of details, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ittaqu rabbakum. Have taqwa and religious integrity. It created you from one soul and created from it zawjaha, its pair, and created many men and many women. And this is to let us know that there are certain family rights. Make sure the whole idea about marriage is to make it safe, to make it secure, healthy for the children, healthy for the woman, and healthy for the man. There are certain rights, responsibilities to basically manage the marriage system in a certain direction. We'll talk about those, inshallah. There are certain things to preserve the family from physical, psychological, and even social disorders. So certainly, when we're speaking about choosing a spouse, definitely it's the most significant decision you'll make in your life, and definitely is more important than what career you choose or what house you buy or what car you buy or whatever, because you're choosing the person that is going to be either the main motivator or the main basically person that's making you probably live in a miserable life for the rest of your life. Halifax, of course, The benefits are better physical, the benefits are better whether we're talking about physical health, resistance to infection, fewer infections, reduced likelihood of dying from cancer and heart disease from all, and even from all major killers. I'm not going to go in all of those details, but of course we know that there are physical benefits, mental health benefits. I'm not going to go in all of those details, but in short, Islam encourages marriage and does not necessarily make it obligatory, except in certain cases. So we'll get to those cases. How does Islam encourage marriage? Number one, the ayah says, فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ. When you look at فَانْكِحُوا, this is an imperative verb that says, well, get married to مَا طَابَ. The word مَا طَابَ meaning desire of number 1, 2, or 3, or even 4 wives. When you say ما طاب, and that basically means desire. So you're saying there doesn't have to be a condition for polygamy. Well, stay tuned till we get to that class to know more. Okay. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, جَعَلَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا وَمِنَ الْأَنْعَامِ أَزْوَاجًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us of a pattern that He had created in the universe, created pairs for you, and created pairs basically from for the animals as well. In other words, the binary system is basically the system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in this universe. Certainly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not fall within this binary system because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond. So this duality or binary system is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let us see to recognize the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly, the Prophet ﷺ had said in Sahih al-Bukhari, تُنْكَحِ الْمَرْأَ لِأَرْبَعٍ لمالها ولحسبها ولجمالها ولدينها فاظفر بذات الدين تربت يدك. The Prophet ﷺ said that women are chosen. So what does that mean, women are chosen? Like he's telling them to choose them for these reasons, or no? He's basically saying that people would choose women. In other words, these are the preferences that different societies might consider as a priority for marriage, whether we're speaking about wealth, we're speaking about beauty, we're speaking about piety. So, or some might choose wealth and consider it just like the people of Rum. They used to consider money as what really matters. The other Arab, they used to consider, well, actually, والحسبها, I didn't choose حسبها here, I didn't translate it here, but الحسب is basically progeny, ancestry. They used to consider that as the most important thing. She comes from this very important family. That was the Arab. And beauty, that was the Persians. They used to consider that to be beautiful is the most important thing. It's got a slim waist, big eyes, and basically, small nose, puffy lips, that's basically what makes beauty. The Arabs' definition of beauty was really rather different. They considered that for the Arab, okay? The Arab's definition of beauty was dark complexion, okay? And white as well. I know they would consider white and dark complexion. That's why they would call it khadra. But they also preferred, not too dark and not too white, okay? And lips, they basically loved the puffy lips. They also loved small waist. They also loved big breasts. I know, big breasts, that was something that they considered as a preference. And unibrow. I know that is weird, but yes, they loved unibrow women. They considered that as attractive. I don't know why, but anyhow, that's what they considered as attractive, okay? And they also considered hair that is long and braided, black hair and hair that is long, and black eyes. Not black eyes, the spooky ones, okay? No, black eyes meaning not brown or not blue and not, and now you understand what I mean, okay? But they considered that that's the most attractive thing, okay? And certainly, height, they also considered not too tall and not too short. That was their preferred. I mean, people have different, different definitions of beauty. And by the way, certain names like Abla and Maria, they actually mean a white, fat woman or a white, fat, beautiful woman. like abla, that's what it means. And Antar ibn Shaddad was in a romantic relationship with Abla, but because his father was Arab, okay, and from Bani Abs, and his mother was a slave, and because he basically got the features from his African mother, his father basically disowned him. But he fell in love with his cousin Abla, who is, well, Arab from both sides, okay, and mother and father, that is. And when he fell in love with her, her father, who's basically Antar ibn Shaddad's uncle, he refused that they would get married because, oh, you've got slaves genes, so we're not gonna consider that. But it isn't until later Antar ibn Shaddad proved that he was a very intelligent person that was making poetry, that was one of the 7 most important poetries that were even hung in Kaaba. In the Kaaba, just imagine, okay? They were called al-Mu'allaqat. Antar ibn Shaddad wasn't only eloquent in poetry, but he was also known to being a very brave and a very courageous and a very mighty man. So yeah, speaking about, I guess, six pack. Yeah, so all right. Anyhow, let's continue right here. Now, is that the same in terms of, well, we didn't continue the hadith. Choose piety or poverty is your destiny. فاظفر بذات الدين تربت يدك. What do you mean فاظفر بذات الدين? فاظفر بذات الدين. الظفر basically means the nail, okay? But this isn't talking about nails. This is the etymology for the word. الظفر basically means it's like you're holding on to something with all your power. Okay, so when you say fazfar, it's like hold on to that. And definitely, it's kind of like thinking of it as claws, but you know, claws have a very, I would say, a wild connotation. But this is to tell you, you know, I want you just like you would see. Just like you would see that a bird will hold on to the prey, like this is the most precious thing and will not let go. And the Prophet ﷺ is telling you, don't let go, not in a wild way, but understand how precious it is to basically get into finding your spouse to be a person of piety. Why? He said, taribat yadak. Taribat yadak means, or else you're going to, it's a metaphor, a figurative word to basically say, or you're going to be ending up facing poverty. Why poverty? I mean, just because a woman is a woman of deen, it doesn't mean that I'm going to be getting provision. Right. It doesn't mean you're going to be getting provision, but it does let you know that wealth, beauty, and even family and progeny and all of that, that wears with time. That wears with time. But piety does not wear unless the person basically did not have that sincerity in their piety. That's a different story. But you really need to search for that piety. Is that the same advice that was given to women? Let's see. There is a hadith. Did I not mention it here? Okay. We'll get to it, inshallah. There is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, I know it's not mentioned here, but we're going to mention it some other time. But well, at least you know, have you see it. But right now I'm going to mention it because of the context that we're in. The Prophet ﷺ for women, telling the awliya. What is al-wali? Al-wali is basically the father, the person in authority, the person in protection for that woman, basically the male figure. He was telling them, إذا جاءكم من ترضون دينه وخلقه فزوجوه. If you get a person that is of good piety, oh, you can't see the slides flipping? Oh dear, you should have told me, man. Oh, la ilaha illallah. And I was flipping all the slides and thinking that you could see what I'm doing. Okay. So the Prophet ﷺ was basically saying, إِذَا جَاءَكُم مَنْ تَرْضَوْنَ دِينَهُ وَخُلُقَهُ فَزَوِّجُوا. If you get a proposal of a man that you would accept and you are content of their piety and their religion, then get them married. Okay, unless and not until you would do that, that would basically affect the society. That would affect the society in bringing corruption. Okay, what is that supposed to mean? I wish you had told me before that I was not on the right slides and giving you those flipping, and I was flipping the slides and thinking that you were capable of seeing it. Oh dear. Sorry about that. Okay. That's okay. Maybe in the future learn the lesson, okay? Okay. So what does that mean? The Prophet ﷺ was telling the awliya, إذا جاءكم, if you get a man that ترضون دينه وخلقه, if you get a man that you would be content over their religion, basically, or religious practices. So we're talking about, in other words, we're seeing a commitment in religion, and we're seeing khuluq. We're also seeing mannerisms, that this person is putting their akhlaq. Are we really just talking about akhlaq to mean just manner? Like what manners they would follow? What do you mean by that? So when we speak about khuluq, we're speaking about a comprehensive word. Let's look at that word. Khalaqa and khuluq. Okay? Now, the word khalaqa is the root. Okay? Now, the word khalaqa means to create something. The word khalaqa means to create something, and you're talking about the external appearance. Okay? But khuluq actually means internal appearance and internal behavior. That's the khuluq. It's the internal makeover of that person. But how am I going to know the internal makeover of that person? So that's the khuluq. And that's what I would want to research about that person and really see the different flags, the different signs that would basically reflect what is this person on the inside. Is this person a greedy person? Is this person hospitable person? Is this person of a mission? Is this person of success? Is this person of dependence? Is this person an independent person, etc.? And we're going to talk about what to look for in a man and what to look for in a woman. We're going to talk about that, okay? Because we definitely need to know, well, what is the definition of a man? It's so, there's so many lecturers out there that would talk about the definitions of a woman. And yes, many shayukh would talk about what a pious woman would look like. But I think it's also time to talk about what a definition of a man is, right? I think that's fair. So we're going to talk about that as well. What is the definition of man compared to definition of male in the Quran? You're going to really find, actually, there is a lecture for me about manhood and masculinity in the Quran or in Islam. So maybe you'll find it on YouTube. Search for it. But we're going to still talk about it in these series, inshallah. Okay, so now we recognize that the Prophet ﷺ was saying, well, you're talking about dinahu wa khuluqahu. That's the main thing that you would want to look for. And ladies, let me tell you something I always say. I know it's important to have a job. I know it's important to have a degree. I know it's important to be good looking. I know all of these things are important, but ladies, let me tell you this secret, okay? I always say it in all my classes. Just because somebody has the money and rich doesn't mean they're hospitable. Just because somebody has a PhD or has a college degree, it does not make them understanding. And just because this man is good looking and handsome, girl, he may not be the person to care about your fulfillment. He may not be the person to care about your feelings. He may not be the person that knows what it means to say a good and a kind word to a woman just because he's got an attractive appearance. So I know that makes things harder, but just keep that one in mind. And that's the same thing. It's not just about men. Same thing about women as well. Just because she basically has a degree doesn't mean that she's going to be understanding and basically be a person that's going to be easily, communicating with you. And just because she's pretty doesn't mean she's going to be fulfilling everything for you. And I've had many cases where she's extremely beautiful, or he's extremely handsome. But then the wife is like, or the husband is like, and they basically look for someone else. Why? Because in appearance in public, it's completely different than when we're talking about a special moment. Let's just say it that way. So it's really important to understand that what you really should be looking for is really the manner. We're talking about integrity. We're talking about honesty. That's a key thing. Honesty. Lying is the worst habit that whether a husband or a wife can actually live in, because it takes away any trust. It makes nothing but insecurity. And that insecurity would bring about fear, would bring about fear of betrayal, fear of being put down, fear of all those different types of fears. Lying is the worst thing that you could speak in terms of akhlaq, whether for a man or for a woman. Be honest, be truthful. And that is a foundation of akhlaq. The second type of akhlaq is sabr, patience. Is this person easily given up? Have they been living entitled? How long had they been working? How long had they been patient enough till they got to probably their successes? Or were they easily giving up when things did not work for them? Or did they put in the perseverance? Because if this person is a quitter, he's going to quit in this marriage really fast, whether it's a female or a male. Oh, I can't handle it. This is too much on me. That's it. And then find themselves exiting. Wait a minute. There's a lot to do. What are you talking about? Things just don't work like that. And this is extremely important to see in terms of akhlaq. We're going to get to more, inshallah, akhlaq, and get to more definitions of what makes akhlaq. And we're going to get to something really important, which is called al-kafa'a and qualifications in marriage. Does my father have the right to object this proposal because he doesn't come from the same tribe or the same country or the same color or the same tradition? Or does he not have the right? And what if he doesn't have the right? What can I do? And what if we're talking about education? Is it permissible for me to refuse this proposal because the man is a teacher and I'm a physician? I'm a doctor, a physician, and therefore I basically would be making $6,000 a month, but he's probably just making $12,000, or probably maybe the whole year barely making 36. For me, I'm probably making 120 grains a year. I'm a doctor, I'm a physician, and I'm the head of the department. Now you know it's definitely not me. Right? But somebody can be asking that, can I refuse this proposal, even though this person memorized this much Quran, this person is a religious person, etc. So can I actually refuse this proposal because that basically is telling me that there's no compatibility? What do we mean by compatibility? How far can it go? Can we talk about job, income, social status, papers, legal status, all these different things? Can we consider that even though this person is good in his deen and good in his akhlaq? Can I say, oh, he doesn't have the legal papers and refuse, or do I have to accept? Because the hadith says, إذا جاءكم من ترضون دينه وخلقه فزوجوه. The hadith says, فزوجوه, and therefore that's an imperative verb telling me that if I do not, and I don't accept this marriage, then the end result is going to be affecting the society, corruption. Well, stay tuned for that class for further details. So in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنْكِحُوا الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ. The ayah really clear says, and get married those that basically are not married, and the salihin as well. In other words, whether from the slaves, or of course, certainly whether we're talking about free people or whether we're talking about slaves. The word free at that time was actually meaning a person outside of the slavery or that bond of slavery system. Okay, so yeah, one of the best books to read if you're confused about slavery, the best book ever written, and I attest that is probably the best book ever written, was by Jonathan Brown, and it's basically called Slavery in Islam. You really gotta, if you're confused about slavery, definitely go to that one. He did an outstanding job. I don't know anybody in history that actually wrote about slavery in Islam better than that book. I think it's a masterpiece, and definitely. By the way, Jonathan Brown, he was a professor at Georgetown University, but then was laid off and fired because of his support of Palestine. Okay, because of his support of Palestine, and basically, yeah, just keep that one in mind. Okay. وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلًا مِّن قَبْلِكَ وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُمْ أَزْوَاجًا وَذُرِّيَّةً. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and we had sent prophets before you, and we had made, or basically made them spouses and children. And the Prophet also, or Prophet رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ. Okay, رَبَّنَا, O Lord Almighty, grant us from our spouses and our children قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ. قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ is actually it's a metaphor, more of an idiom. Okay, it's an idiom to actually mean something that will bring delight to our eyes. Okay, but it's an idiom to basically speak about delight that even my eyes can show it. That's a very strong level of being delighted. And certainly in Jannah, there's a place, and Jannah is a place where marriage is a reward. Marriage is a reward. Yes, marriage is a reward. So if you can have marriage, is one of, just like food is one of those rewards and one of those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us is found in Jannah. What does that mean? Well, that's to tell you that marriage is one piece of Jannah. Think of it that way. Well, yes, ma'am. Marriage is one piece of Jannah. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَهُمْ فِيهَا أَزْوَاجٌ مُطَهَّرَةٌ وَهُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. And they would have pairs or spouses that are pure, and they would be dwelling there eternally. In another ayah, جَنَّاتُ عَدْنٍ يَدْخُلُونَهَا وَمَنْ صَلُحَ مِنْ آبَائِهِمْ وَأَزْوَاجِهِمْ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ. They would enter the Jannah of Adan, and whoever was in piety from their fathers, their spouses, and even their children. So, but let's just say someone says, well, I understand marriage is important. I understand all of that, but to be honest, marriage is not a thing for me. It's not for me. And can I just not get married? And plus, I think it's going to distract me from my religion, from all the different things that I would want to do for the society, to basically help, to basically make da'wah, to basically pray qiyam al-layl, and to do all of that. Well, this is the answer. This hadith. Three men came to the house of the Prophet ﷺ to inquire about the Prophet ﷺ's worship. So what were they doubting? It was like, is he really at the same level? And how is he worshiping? So when they were informed by Sayyidah Aisha, that is, they considered their worship as basically at a better state, and that the Prophet ﷺ, when they compared to his worship, they basically said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven his past sins and future sins. I mean, yeah, we are not like him, so we basically have to put in more effort to basically make sure that we'll make it to Jannah. The first one said, as for me, I shall offer salat all night long. The other said he basically fasts continuously and does not break it. The other one said that he abstains from marriage and women and he would never marry. And the Prophet ﷺ came back to the house and said, are you the people who said such things? 1, 2, 3. And they said, yes. He said, by Allah, I fear Allah more than you, and I'm most obedient to the Lord Almighty, but I still observe fast and I break my fast. I perform salah and sleep at night and even get married. So whoever turns away from my path, from my sunnah, does not belong to me. In other words, this isn't what Islam would be. So unless the person had a reason why they don't want to get married, then that's a different situation. If, let's say, she said, well, I'm a person that has a bad attitude, and I just know that if I were to get married, I don't know how to change that attitude, and I just know that marriage isn't for me because I have this attitude. Or perhaps she felt that she's got a trauma that she must heal first from. Maybe as a child she was molested, maybe something like that. I would say, well, you can go through therapy. That's out there and help can be found. But let's say she tried and she's still not healed entirely, and she knows that she wasn't going to be capable of fulfilling the marriage rights and responsibilities, and she preferred to stay not married than actually stay married. That's permissible, okay, if there's a reason. Let's see, marriage and realities. Now, here's one thing we're seeing, although marriage is very important, but we're seeing the importance of marriage is dropping amongst Americans, amongst the West, because marriage is basically seen as not necessary. And certainly when we're speaking about feminism, basically portraying marriage as nothing but a way to control women and not necessarily as a commitment to the bond. So they'll basically consider that at least, and as long as you're committed within the relationship of boyfriend, girlfriend, etc., that's all that matters. There doesn't have to be a legal way or at least a religious way to bring about this bond. Well, that's not something Islam considers. We already know that. Within the Muslim community, marriage is also finding a number of different, let's call it obstacles. Number one, we've got financial problems. Of course, when we say financial problems, we're talking about expectations. that definitely are going too high. They're expected to have enough money to get married in this extravagant hotel, to bring a scene, to pay this much, and certainly to have already probably a home and probably maybe a degree to ensure employment at a certain level, etc. And finding the right person is also hard. When we say finding the right person, of course, especially in the West, we would be talking about, area that's probably a very vast area. And sometimes they're not capable of getting to know who's there. And many women, no one knows anything about them. And many men, they're basically not finding these women. And even the masajid, the women would be completely separate and the men are completely separate. And not unless we had an old auntie that's probably maybe being the correspondent between the guy side and the girl side and basically coming in to correspond between the two, then of course that basically finding the right person becomes hard. Well, we're not just talking about finding a male and a female, but we're also talking about finding the right person. The right person meaning the person that is compatible to your qualifications. That also makes it hard. So we'll talk about, inshallah, can I use online platforms as matchmaking? By the way, I used to be a matchmaker, so I'll tell you a lot about those profiles. Not necessarily what's in the profile, but all right, but I'll tell you a lot about my experience in that matchmaking and what to actually and what guys look for and what girls look for, and what might be too utopian, what might be realistic. And I'll just give you a sneak peek on these profiles, what's written in it, and what do guys just swipe right away and like, no, not my type, and just basically go out. So we're going to talk about that. No, the other thing is cultural differences. Cultural differences are a key obstacle because these children, they probably grew up maybe in Turkey, the US, UK, wherever, and then they had developed as a third generation or a second generation, they developed new mindsets, new ways of communication. Their language is not the language that their parents were speaking, and they now speak a different language, which basically carries not just a language, it carries a mindset, it carries a way of communication, it carries a number of different things of how we consider social roles as well. So those cultural differences can play a very key factor in how a marriage might work out or not work out. Let me tell you a secret. I personally do not recommend people getting married from other cultures. Let me explain why. Even though, alhamdulillah, I'm married and my husband comes from a completely different culture. Completely different culture. I'm Palestinian. At least most of me is Palestinian. Okay. Born in the US and raised partially in Palestine. Okay. And partially in the US. My husband raised in Tunisia, born in Tunisia, completely Tunisian. Okay. And even when it came to food, there was a completely different thing. When it came to accent, oh my God, that was like a whole language barrier. I personally thought that they didn't even speak Arabic, and the list goes on and on. But that's not why I would recommend against marrying from your own culture. The reason why, alhamdulillah, my marriage is a successful marriage, but the reason why, based on my experience, the way that people would relate with others is based on a certain package of expectations. So we would define my role and my expectation of, let's say, a husband is looking at his wife, that this is what defines being feminine. This is what I expect you to do at home or in private life. And this is what would mean that you would look like in a certain category. In his mind, this is what a wife should be. Same thing. She would have a number of different definitions of what makes masculinity, what defines what a man is supposed to be doing. Who's supposed to be doing this chore or that chore? Who's expected from this? Now, here's the thing. When we get married, we have a set of expectations, and these set of expectations, without us realizing where they had come from, but a lot of these expectations, they had been built basically from a culture factor, from the society, the environment, the list goes on. From our parents, we would mimic our parent, he would mimic his parent or whatever it is, and then we would expect that this is what you're supposed to be doing. A lot of the marriages that come from two different cultures, they end up falling apart. Not always, okay, but many marriages would end up falling apart, not because she was bad or he was bad, they would both be good. But if you get into that problem or that dispute between them, and I did a lot of marriage counseling from Islamic side, so I'm not a marriage counselor to mean, that like a therapist, but no, we did a lot of trying to communicate with the men and with the women and trying to resolve different matters. The marriages that have these types of frictions, they would usually have these frictions where he's expecting a certain thing, she's expecting a certain thing, and they clash. And then they would come in and say, well, doesn't Islam say this? And then I would end up saying, actually, that's related to culture that you both have to compromise. And a lot of the dispute that happens when it comes to culture defines roles, defines positions without us realizing. It carries a whole unspoken, keep that one in mind. It carries a whole unspoken way of communicating, and therefore you would be confused that, oh, I did this, and he's interpreting it, oh, you're trying to here send me a message that I'm not man enough. And you are really surprised, like, what? How did you get there? I didn't mean it that way. And then it was a set of different things that you're confused. How did he interpret it that way? Or she might say, or he might say, how did she interpret it this way? And you're confused and she's confused. And what lies behind these disputes, by the way, is not an issue of right and wrong always. It really carries within it our expectation of social roles, social expectations that are not spoken. So when they're fighting over who's going to be, let's say, probably buying the groceries, or her, does she need a permission to go grocery shopping or probably go to school or whatever it is, or, he's probably telling, what, your clothes are too tight and please change them or whatever. And of course, the fight is usually not in, is this right or wrong? The fight is usually one, autonomy. Who is in control? Who's in power? Who is transgressing my space of personal territory, personal respect, or whatever it is? Number two is the part about honor, and number three is emotions. The fights are usually unspoken, but they're actually relating to these three issues. One, autonomy. Two, we're talking about roles and responsibilities and all of that. And number three, we're talking about emotions. Is he considering my emotions? Is she, and especially women, is he considering my emotions? Does he understand it, etc.? And the women would prefer not to talk about the real issue that's making her sad. So she'll come and complain about or talk about, something that happened at work or that whatever happened at school or whatever it is. Okay. And then for a man, he'll be like, okay, here's a solution. Pragmatic thinking. Here's a solution. But she's not actually looking for a solution. And she's actually looking for a ventilation, a listening ear. That's all. She's not looking for a solution. The second you put in the solution, that's what to her means you're not interested in listening and you think she's boring. You don't care about emotions. For the man, he's like, I'm just trying to do what a man is supposed to do. Probably give you the solution to a problem. That's what I'm understanding. A very important book. You must read. You want to take a credit for this class? You got to read that book too, along with that fiqh. Okay? That book is an audio as well. The men are from Venus. Men are from Venus and women are from Mars. You have to read that book. Many marriages, they would come to me and right at that the threshold of getting a divorce, I would say, listen, before you do that, please go read that book. And then everything just, it kind of like, like an epiphany. It's like, okay, now I get it. You got to read that book. And it'll help you understand a lot. Okay, let's say, let's say, here the sister is saying, some cultures don't see divorce as a big deal. In some places, it's so common, it's treated carelessly. There's even a saying that when a man divorces his wife, he divorces the kids too. So if we're distancing ourselves from our culture because of these kinds of mindset and norms, well, I don't want to say don't marry from that culture. I mean, it could be the right, it could be the right choice for you. I mean, I'm basically married from a different culture. Okay. Even though I'm advising you not to marry from a different culture, but I'll tell you, it can be successful and it can be the most successful thing that you could do, but not until you recognize that you're willing to compromise a lot of the different packages that were not spoken, that were not probably recognized by you, etc., and that you're willing to compromise. I would tell you, if you're not willing to compromise, don't get into all of these, because it's not going to be something that is probably going to be an easy thing for you to communicate, for you to establish I guess a new start and relearn and unlearn a lot of the different norms. So I'm not saying, don't get married from this culture or that culture, because just because somebody comes from a certain culture, it doesn't mean that that yes, they carry everything from that culture. Somebody can be, let's say, culture A, but then they don't necessarily carry everything. Maybe culture A is so misogynist, let's say, okay? That doesn't mean that this person carries everything that that culture carries. But I'll tell you one thing. There's definitely still going to be a trace, okay? What is that trace? How did that trace affect that person? Well, that's for you to do your homework. How do we do the homework? Well, you can't study the future because you don't know the future, but your window to the future is basically by looking at the past. How did this person make their choices based on? What choices did they do? How do they deal with their mother? What do they think about their family, etc.? If somebody is looking at that, past and that history to help you see the future and how they relate with their family, that's going to tell you a lot about how they treat women and how this person respects or disrespects and what they think of that woman, etc., and what they're going to basically how they're going to view you as well. The name of the book, Men Are From Mars. Okay, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I said it the other way around. Well, I guess I didn't know the planets. I never went to Mars. So I don't really know if that's where the men are, but never went to Venus. Well, wait a minute. No, I was in Venus. I was in Venus. Remember, that's where the women are. All right, everybody. Inshallah, this is the end for today. Inshallah, we'll talk about more about, the earthling issues, inshallah, and away from all these different alien stuff. And yeah, inshallah, next week, we'll make sure, well, not actually next week. It's the day after tomorrow. The day after tomorrow. Stay tuned for more earthling topics. And inshallah, we'll continue with marriage realities. We'll talk about some of these things. By the way, this is just a prelude. We still didn't hit the core, okay? All right, inshallah. We'll continue, inshallah, the day after tomorrow. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to talk about, inshallah, issues that concern you. But if there's something that inshallah, I plan to talk about in the future, so I'll say, hey, we're going to talk about this in the future, inshallah. And if anybody would like to unmute themselves, go ahead. You are on live stream, and right after, just after those that are okay with being on live stream, then we take off the live stream for, privacy. Okay. Let's see right there. I'm going to take off, I guess, the live stream for those that don't want to be live.